All right, man, peace. You know, brothers, when you attain enough life experience, you come to the understanding that sometimes two factions, two components, two energies, they just don't mix. And they're never going to mix. And when you learn those things, you understand how to divest yourself from what something represents when you know that it's just not for you. And other people who don't mature in life, they have a very difficult time understanding why people do not like or dislike what they like or dislike. And that leads to a lot of unnecessary confrontation. And over the years, we've seen beefs manifest. They normally start out subconsciously or subliminally, and then they eventually erupt. We saw that with Nas and Jay-Z back in the late 90s. You may have seen that in your everyday life. Sometimes in your workplace, there'll be somebody there who one of your colleagues, quote unquote, just does not like or just does not get along with. You might have friends who might not, quote unquote, like your woman, or your woman might not like your friends. Your family member might not like one of your friends or your woman or what have you, whatever. Point being is this. Over the course of life, you mature. You understand what's for you, or hopefully you mature. You understand what's for you and what's not for you. And that also happens with ideologies. Sometimes you start off young and you might learn a certain discipline or religion and you leave it alone. Sometimes you're surrounded by a mental mind frame that you think is right when you're young. And then you get older and you see the error of your ways, your mind broadens. And I believe that that has occurred with Mr. Floyd Mayweather and a lot of the pro-blackity-black rhetoric. Because if you remember, and I always say this, Floyd Mayweather was one of the only so-called black athletes in the late 2000s, early 2010s, who actually was, quote unquote, speaking up for black people, quote unquote, or for the so-called black community. He was one of the few doing that during that time period. He got incarcerated right after the Miguel Cotto fight. And it seemed as though he elevated to a higher level of understanding, especially with the importance or the prominence that the economic aspect of his life had to take so that he could assist the people that he wanted to assist on a higher level without a lot of the fruitless banter and rhetoric. I think that he's understood or come to understand, like many more mature-minded black men have come to understand, so-called black men, that for the most part, pro-blackity blacks are full of shit. Them and their silly boycotts are normally based on attention mongering, trying to get the so-called white man to love them. And make no mistake about it, the blackface issue is a major issue. Many prominent clothing brands and other corporations and companies for that matter have tried to very slickly and slyly use quote unquote Sambo imagery or quote unquote Uncle Tom imagery, or trying to align the so-called black man to an ape or monkey in some way, shape or form, whether it be in a cartoon or what have you. They tried to do that, and that has to be addressed. And we'll have to go through the etymology of that to get a full understanding of how that has occurred. But what many of these wokety woke pro-blackity blacks try to do, they try to tell you how to think, and they have no end game. And I believe that that is what Floyd Mayweather is attacking more than anything else. The understanding that the pro-black, the so-called pro-black, so-called, and I say that because they have no understanding of who they really are. They don't know their real race. They don't know their culture. They have no desire to know. Really, all they want to do is go back and forth with the white man all day. I believe that Mayweather understands that most of what pro-blackity blacks say is based in envy and seeking out validation from the Caucasian. That's why they want to, quote unquote, boycott Gucci, when most so-called black people should not be buying Gucci in the first place because it's way outside of your price range. That's number one. There are so-called black people out here who buy Louis Vuitton and Gucci and Prada and so on and so forth, and they cannot even pay their light bill. And now they're trying to tell a person who makes 9 figures a year how he should be spending his money. Now, make no mistake about it. Floyd Mayweather is a Luciferian. I've covered that in other videos, and I'm going to continue to cover it pertaining to Mr. Mayweather. But when it comes to certain concrete decisions that he makes and making sure that the mob mentality, the lynch mob mentality of the social justice warriors, the internet revolutionaries, the pro-blackity blacks know their place and know to stay in their place, he's normally on point with that because he does have a ruling class mentality. He does not get caught up in political factions and what social media is telling him to think or to say. So I give him credit for that. So he recently decided that he was going to go into a major Gucci store and spend 6 figures in that store. Of course, the internet revolutionaries got upset. They utilized the normal diatribes, calling him a coon and what have you. But as I always say about the pro-blackity blacks, if you ask them if the dope boy around their way is a coon, if the gang member around their way is a coon, if the woman heading to the abortion clinic is a coon, if the woman who's not taking proper care of her children and has strange men around her children is a coon, I guarantee you they will not give you the affirmative on any of those type of people in their community, so-called community. None of those people are coons. The person in your apartment complex or your so-called projects who's spraying up the hallway and pissing in the elevator, those people are not coons. But because a prominent so-called black celebrity does not want to conform to what you think they should be doing, then suddenly they're a coon. And I mentioned this in the video that I did on Adrian Broner pertaining to the sick and perverse mentality of idolatry. Normally, when people venerate a god, they obey that god. But when you idolize a person, you put them on a pedestal, and then in a very, very strange way, you expect that entity that you place on a pedestal to obey you. And that always leads to conflict. And that's why it's very dangerous to court acceptance from people, or to court attention from them, or to seek them to follow you. That's very dangerous because you're setting yourself up for a very bad ending. Whenever you create a cult of personality, you're also creating a potential mob. So anyway, they're going to talk about it, and I'm going to chime in.
Floyd Mayweather doesn't give a damn about the Gucci boycott, despite huge stars like T.I. and Spike Lee calling for people to stay off the fashion brand.
Well, first off, T.I. and Spike Lee are not huge stars. What T.I. and Spike Lee are a couple of Luciferians looking for attention on social media. Spike Lee is a woman worshiper. And both Spike Lee and T.I. are a couple of pansexuals. T.I. needs to answer, why is it that somebody who allegedly has 3 felonies can go to prison for only a few months when he's found to have assault weapons on him? That's something that he has not fully explained yet. So if one of you brothers can explain that to me, please let me know how a so-called black man who supposedly has multiple felonies can be found with assault weapons and only go to prison for a few months. Very strange. And Spike Lee I'll be covering in another video.
Over a sweatshirt they've deemed as racially insensitive or racist. And as a matter of fact, Floyd went back to the store, to Gucci, and dropped a ton of money there last night, and we've got the video. Welcome to TMD Sports. Evan here with Van Lathan.
What up?
Michael J. Babcock.
What's up?
All right, so Van, give us the backstory on the Gucci boycott.
So the backstory of the boycott is that Gucci put out a sweater, and the sweater zips up in the front, and when the sweater zips up, there's a big red set of lips and the dark or black kind of turtleneck that makes a lot of people feel like this sweater, in a way, was blackface.
Yeah,
in other words, you don't really know if it's meant to be blackface, but you could suspect that it's blackface. And let me say once again, many of these so-called high-end fashion lines, they do have a history of trying to indirectly mock the so-called black man. But what we also have to remember, and when I say we, I'm talking about so-called black men who think on a high level, is that our people and the so-called Caucasian, they have a very unhealthy infatuation with one another. Wokety woke pro-blacks, they love to talk about cultural appropriation, but it's always a one-way street. They love talking about how these so-called white men dresses up in blackface, but many famous so-called black comedians, they also dress up in whiteface. The Wayans brothers had a very famous film where they dressed up as white women. So if you're seeking out the Caucasian man's validation so badly, which is what most pro-blacks and wokety woke Negroes are seeking out, you do have to give over that olive branch and confess that you should not be dressing up in whiteface if you don't want your God and Savior, the Caucasian, to dress up in blackface. If you don't want the Caucasian woman to culturally appropriate you supposedly by wearing braids, then you should stop sewing in blonde weaves into your hair or straight hair weaves into your head. That's what you should be stopping. And again, by no means am I trying to poo-poo the notion that a high-end fashion line like Gucci could be trying to mock the so-called black man with this sweater. I will say this. There is the potential that that is the case. There's also the potential that they were trying to be overly artsy. Who knows? I mean, to me, the sweater is ugly anyway. The point being is this. Our people need to be focusing on higher things. The so-called black man needs to be focusing on making sure that he can control his household. At the end of the day, 99% of so-called blacks in America should not be buying Gucci clothes anyway, because it's outside of their economic bubble. It truly is for the most part.
People are upset.
If you see the old blackface images, that is how they look. The reaction was swift, and big stars like T.I. said, no more Gucci, we're not wearing it. They trying to play.
Right, so
Once again, let me say this. The history of blackface is very multifaceted. What became mockery actually started off as an attempt at veneration. The old Moorish dance of the Middle Ages. There are still customs in certain parts of Europe that go back 600, 700, 800 years. Like Black Pete, where many of the Europeans, they have no idea that so-called blacks in America would find it offensive. They just see it as a part of their culture that oftentimes they have no understanding of where it comes from. Because most modern day Europeans have no idea that at one time so-called blacks ruled over Europe. And that prior to the quote-unquote bubonic plague, or the so-called black plague of the 1300s, so-called blacks represented the majority of the people in Europe prior to the so-called bubonic or black plague. But that's a whole other video. The point being is this: the whole blackface concept is very, very multi-layered. It's not just something to be castigated, it's something to be investigated.
So a lot of other stars have followed suit and said, you know what, that's right. Until they're more sensitive, we are out. No more Gucci for us. Well, Floyd Mayweather apparently didn't get the memo and decided to go to Gucci last night in Beverly Hills.
I mean, to be quite honest with you, when you have as much money as Floyd, you're going to dress a little strange sometimes. Who the fuck would wear an outfit like that other than Floyd Mayweather? Floyd has so much money and time on his hands that he can afford to wear shit that nobody else would wear, even if you had sense and money. I mean, look at that outfit. It looks like your grandmother's sofa or her living room curtains. I mean, come on.
Beverly Hills. And even when we talked to him and explained to him, we're like, look, man, there's a boycott right now. Do you care about this? He said, absolutely not. I don't care.
Now listen to what the wokety woke super liberal Caucasian Jewish man stated. He said, even after we explained to Floyd that there's a boycott going on, you don't care about this. Once again, behind the liberal so-called Negro is the liberal Caucasian Jew. Always understand that. So a lot of the vitriol that Floyd Mayweather faces in mainstream media about his decision to continue to purchase those clothes is coming from the liberal Caucasian Jew who's putting a battery in the back of these woke Negroes on the internet who have no end game. Once again, the woke Negro has no end game whatsoever. They never have and they never will. They talk about Kaepernick, but when you tell Negroes, okay, let's form our own football league, that's no dice, that's no bueno. Because our people don't have the administrative skills nor the trust from a business perspective to say, we're going to get into business with one another and we're going to make it work. Because we have all the talent already, but our people don't trust one another. These are the concepts that our people do not want to address in the real conversations that we're supposed to be having with one another, as opposed to obsessing over this magical, mystical conversation with the white man that is supposed to make everybody feel better. That's never going to happen. That's never going to happen.